Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks very much for being here on this lovely day. Thank you to 192 Books for hosting this. Thank you to World Poetry for making it possible. And thank you to our two esteemed panelists, who I will introduce in just a minute. But first, a little business. These lovely books are available for sale there. So don't forget, immediately after, rush up, be the first in line, buy yourselves a copy. I'm going to start you off with a quote. May we be ruled by the idea of the salvation of the earth by woman, of the transcendent vocation of woman, a vocation which has been systematically concealed, thwarted, or led astray to our day. The time has come to value the ideas of woman at the expense of those of man, whose bankruptcy has become tumultuously evident today. Those words were written in 1944 by André Breton, surveying the devastation of World War II and realizing that what men had put together so far was not working very well. Now, the question, though, is that's a grand promise. Did Surrealism hold that promise? Well, the answer in a word is yes and no. Some say that it offered women opportunities, an agency much greater than they would have had, and that was offered by society at the time. Others that had marginalized women who are elevated as muses, lovers, inspiration, but very rarely as creators in their own right. The English surrealist Ithell Colquhoun, for instance, reflected that despite pronouncements such as the one that I just read you, women as human beings tended to be permitted, not required. And Leonora Carrington, who I had the pleasure of getting to know a little bit and meeting several times, told me once that in her estimation, surrealism was another bullshit role for women. But we're not going to solve that very thorny question today. This afternoon, we're here to celebrate two women, artists and poets both, who were part of the surrealist movement, who took the energy that they found in surrealism, combined it with the energy that was in themselves, and turned it into something completely of their own, something that eludes definition and classification, something that stands outside of surrealism, non-surrealism, poetry, non-poetry, art, non-art. And I will just wrap this up with the quote from one of these, Meret Oppenheim, who told an earnest young interviewer when he was trying very hard to pigeonhole her, is, listen, young man, she said, there is no difference between men and women. There is only a difference between artist and poet. So with that, Meret Oppenheim is mainly known as the creator of Object, also known as Fur-Covered Cup and Saucer, in which you can see right here in town at MoMA. It was the first work of art by a woman to enter MoMA's permanent collection. It is arguably the most famous surrealist work of all, perhaps next to Dali's Melted Watches. And the thing is, of course, because of that, one tends to think that that's what she did. But in fact, Oppenheim created many, many other works in many, many other different mediums, as those of you who were able to see the retrospective at MoMA several years ago discovered. And on top of her plastic creations, she was also a poet. And some of those poems are here. The other artist that we are celebrating today is Joyce Mansour. Joyce Mansour joined the movement later in its history, after the war. She is one of the most important poets to come out of the surrealist movement. Her first book, Cri, translated as Screams, came out in 1953, and it caught the attention of André Breton, who immediately recognized a kindred spirit. She became a regular attendee at the cafe sessions, was involved very much with not only the literary production, but also their manifestations, the events, and the political activities that they had. And she is also known for having hosted in her very lovely 16th arrondissement apartment the performance in 1959 of the Execution and Testament of the Marquis de Sade, a performance piece by Jean Benoit, which ended with him taking a hot iron and branding himself on the chest, and then holding it out to the audience and saying, "Who's next?" And someone actually ran up and did it. I'll leave you with that thought for a second. So to present the works of these two poet artists, we're honored to have tonight, this afternoon, C. Francis Fisher, and Kathleen Heil. And I'm going to read Catherine's bio from this very handy one that's here in the book. C. Francis Fisher received her MFA in poetry from Columbia University. Her work has appeared in the Brooklyn Rail, the Yale Review, and the Los Angeles Review of Books, among others. She curates Colloquy, the New York City event series that provides a forum for translators to engage with live audiences in an exploration of the art of translation. In the Glittering Maw is her first book in translation. Kathleen Heil is an artist whose practice encompasses dance, performance, and the writing and translating of poetry and prose. She's the author of the poetry collection You Can Have It All, forthcoming from with Moist Books in November of 2024, this November. And she's the translator of The Loveliest Vowel Empties, Meret Oppenheim's collected poems from World Poetry. Her literary translations appear in The New Yorker, The Paris Review, The Threepenny Review, and other journals. She's originally from New Orleans, but she is lucky enough to live and work now in Berlin, one of my favorite cities. So with that, I have a question for the two of you. Very simple one. What attracted you to this poet?
Yeah, I think for me, it was Meret Oppenheim's singularity, which comes forth, I think, not just in the physical artwork she made, but also the poetry itself. But before I finish answering that question, I also want to do a plug for Mark's fantastic book, Why Surrealism Matters, which came out this May at Yale University Press, and I think it's also for sale. And I'm sure he'd be happy to sign a copy if you want to get it. It's a wonderful distillation of why this movement matters. And
I didn't pay her for that.
and yeah, Oppenheim's poetry, I think there's something about the way in which it's humorous, it's imaginative, it's cutting, it's sharp. And there is, for me, we spoke about this, Catherine and I, at an event on Tuesday, I had this sense of also being able to kind of hear the work without mediation. So there was something about an intimacy that I felt with the text too that made me feel that as a translator, I could humbly also embody the work as a poet, which felt important.
I think what drew me to the work of Joyce Mansour is the emotional space she allows for women. There's a sort of way in which I think she allows women to be not just as accomplished or artistic as men, but also just as violent, just as ravenous. She allows for the darker side of what you might call equality. And I think that that's a sort of underexplored version of something like feminism, not necessarily a term that Mansour herself identified with, importantly, but I think now we can understand these texts that way. And I think also the eroticism and desirousness of her poetry was quite important to me as well.
Thank you. That's terrific. Kathleen, this question for you. So you mentioned feeling that the work that you understood the work without mediation. And yet one of the things that struck me is that Oppenheim herself did a lot of self-translation, and that these poems were often, I guess, from German to French or French to German. And then you, of course, are coming along and translating them into English. Was there a particular quality that you noticed because of that self-translation, and did that impact on your work in English?
Yeah, that's a great question. It was interesting because I had the feeling, so the 7 poems that are part of her collected, that Oppenheim wrote in French, she translated herself into English. And these poems, when she translates them, I would say that Oppenheim uses sound to build associative sense. So there's this way in which she's really letting the image come through the sonorific circumstances. And I wonder if that's also about writing in French too, because I think sometimes when you have, let's say, more distance from a language, there's this way in which you hear it and hear the plasticity more. I had this experience, at least when I write poems in German, which I do more as an experiment in exploring plasticity of language, not with any kind of ambition to be a German language poet. It's just more about exploring the form. And I think when I look at her poems in French, when she does the translation in German, there's a way in which descriptive meaning is foregrounded, and in a way, I wanted to not let that impede my ability to embody also the other facets of what were happening in the poems.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting because I could think of two writers, Leonora Carrington, for one, who obviously grew up speaking English but wrote a lot in French, and I think also in Spanish, and Linda Lay, who was born in Vietnam, speaking Vietnamese, but is now living in France and writes in French. And both of them have written about that distance, but that sort of plastic quality of language that you get from having that distance where the language becomes a kind of an object. You don't take things for granted. The words, the phrases actually mean something to you a little bit different from someone who just uses them naturally. And they tend to have a much more concrete quality, even if that's not what they mean. And Linda Lay, for example, I mean, I translated one of her books and this drove me crazy because she would take a phrase, which was a sort of a stock phrase, and then start dissecting it literally and then running with it into the various images. It's like, it doesn't work that way in English. It doesn't mean the same thing. You know, it's like, it drive you nuts. Would you like to read us perhaps a couple of poems so we can hear?
Pleasure. Maybe I'll start with one of the French poems if I can find them. And I'll read this poem in the French, which is what she wrote it in first, and then in my English translation. Je sens mon œil se tourner vers les fruits de la lune. Je sens ma douceur se diriger vers ses proverbes nourrissants. Et mon coquetterie en cœur, où va ta vérité? And I should mention nearly all of Meret Oppenheim's poems, with the exception of 3 or 4 are untitled, so this is one of the untitled poems. I feel my gaze make its way to the forest and the moon. I feel my compass bearing toward these nourishing proverbs. And yet, my beautiful crocodile of my heart, where is your pride headed to?
Well, please.
I'll do it 2 or 3 more. Zanzibar, auf Deutsch. Weil sich den Rücken kehrt, verliert über den Kaminen, die wurden Ecklein, die wurden Füchslein. Alle leben einsam, sie zehren am längsten, sie essen ihren Pelz. This is a titled poem. I should mention Zanzibar is the title. As he's turned his back, he's lost above the chimneys, the little red corners, the little red foxes, all live forlorn, they ever endure, they eat their fur. For now, I'll just read 2 more short ones. I'll read this one again in German. Osten, Winden, Osten, die Ebene will rosten, die verlegen und vergessen ihn nicht. In vielen Wagen hängt man nicht, trotz weiß und weiß ein wenig, trotz roten Stein am Lebenslicht. Anstelle sie den König, nur wer die Wedernase liebt, hat weiß und sie den König. East winches east, the plains will creak, flitting and forget-me-not, and many carts one does not course, though knows in noirs at little, the red stone and the light, and the of sieve and king. Only those who love the wheel muse have noirs and sieve and king. And the last one I'll read is the title-ish poem of the collection. This was also the title of a painting she gave to Max Ernst upon dumping him or breaking up with him. Hush Hush, de Chance de Vocal in Leipzig, which its appropriately, our historical title is Quick, Quick, the Most Beautiful Vowel Empties, and I've translated it for the purposes of not having a clumsy double superlative in the English as the Loveliest Vowel Empties. Von Bären nährt man sich, mit dem Schuh verehrt man sich. Hush, hush, du schönste Vokal in Leipzig. We feed on berries, we worship with the shoe. Whoosh, the loveliest vowel empties.
Thank you very much. That was lovely. Catherine, question for you. So Marianne Cause, the wonderful Marianne Cause, in her introduction to this book, calls Mansour a many-voiced writer, a chameleon, and says that the poems shift both topics and temporalities. So if you're constantly standing on ground that's shifting, how did this affect your translation? How did you approach it?
It's a great question. I think that one of the difficulties I had when thinking about how to translate these poems was was their surrealism. And Mansour has a way of engaging many different images in a single poem. And I think the trick of the translation is trying to understand why they were put together. In the same moment, Mansour, I think, wants to sort of obfuscate that from the reader. So as the translator, I had to have a reading of the poem that made it make sense to me, why these things were appearing in a certain sequence, but not be so overt about that it changed the nature of the reading process for somebody reading the poems in English. How I went about that? Well, I think that certain poems opened themselves to me, whereas others didn't. There were certainly poems that, so Mansour had a very large body of work. And so this is just, it's focused on her late work, this collection. And it's just, I selected the poems. It's a selected volume. And part of the reason for that was that there were certain poems that just remained, I might have loved them, but I couldn't translate them. They remained somewhat obscure to me in a way that made them, hopefully someday some other translator will be able to do them, but I couldn't.
Or you.
Or me. Yeah, me at a later date. Yeah, does that answer the question?
That answers it, and it actually anticipates another question I'm going to ask both of you. But before we do that, would you like to give us a little sample?
Sure, I
of
would
your
love
sampling?
to. A sampling of my sampling. I'll start here. So Mansour in her lifetime collaborated with a lot of visual artists, and one of them was Pierre Alishinsky, who's on the cover here. I love that World Poetry let me do this cover. And so this poem called Beneath the Central Tower is dedicated to Mata, who is another painter. Beneath the central tower, hands wandered over the keys, and strange words issued from her, floated on the surface of the stream. I heard the dialect of undressing sexes. Hands wrote on the valves 24/7, and assassinations would have to follow. In the same bluish twilight where the steel serpents hiss, where seagulls cry and mature women flourish with inflamed pistols and junky wounds. I was a little intimidated. It would have been so luxurious to have the power to piss in the street. She's really funny, as well as being incredibly dark and morbid. I like this poem because I like to imagine that she went out one night with Mata to a bar and he stepped into an alleyway and peed in the street, and she was frustrated that she couldn't do the same. It's just a feeling I might or might not have had in my life. So when I was translating these poems, I was also writing a series of my own work that were persona poems in the voice of biblical women. And I found these poems in Mansour's work that were also giving voice to many of the same characters. And at the time, it felt really fortuitous. And obviously, it's not. I mean, you know, people have been writing about Eve since the dawn of time. But this poem is called Simply Solitude. Second Eve in the afternoon, the sun melts in her red hair, red like the flow of her previous menstruations. I have blood on my mind. Even decapitated, the moth bristled on the flame, coward of eggs. Some pick oranges under the light shower. Others open their thighs, sneeze. Oh, vast night fringed with grass, preopic, the seated woman, the standing clitoris. The tongue has retired. The blood no longer spurts. Women scorch like sheets of paper, whiten and die, ululate and metamorphose on their hysterical hook. Oh, vast bilingual night like an autopsy. Second Eve, the night, in the iodine flows of the present cold, stranded on the battered sands. So here there's whiten and die as DYE, which is a happy accident of translation because in English, it also sounds like D-I-E, which is a large preoccupation of Mansour, but in the French, it doesn't at all. And so people love to talk about what's lost in translation, but things can also be found. Maybe I'll read one more. The chameleon's tongue. I will come to your home on the 40th day. I will come because my limbs whiten in your absence. I am hungry for your enemies, ashamed of my weakness for tidal currents, undulating like the greedy snake. I would rub against ecstasy if I weren't afraid to gather the ashes in my mother's womb, in the hollow of the swell, in the glittering maw of the church.
Thank you. So this leads beautifully into my next question. You talked about, both of you have sort of talked in some way about adaptation and how, the challenges of translation, which, as we all know, is not just word for word replacement. But in these poems, these two bodies of work, it seems like it's a particular concern and a particular challenge for a variety of reasons. One of them being the wordplay that both poets engage in. And of course, the notion that, Mansour was writing in a language that was not her native language. Oppenheim is translating back and forth between languages. To what extent one always adapts, one always has to recreate, but to what extent, if any, did you find that this impacted on the translation of these particular books, perhaps more than what you normally do? Or in other words, what was the role of that? And was there ever a point where you were concerned that the needs of adaptation were beginning to make you stray a little bit too far for the benefit of effect away from what the poem was actually trying to say?
Well, I'm going to steal or borrow something Catherine said the other day. 'Cause I really
Damn
liked
it. Maybe I need it.
Which was talking about translation as a frame. I really liked that. Hopefully I'm still on the way. But I'll use that as a jumping off point, so maybe you can say more about that. I actually think it was really helpful. I had the good fortune of, in terms of the timeline, that the retrospective of Oppenheim's work was at the Kunstmuseum Bern. While I was working on the translations, I think we had already, with World Poetry, worked out that we were going to do the book. But I realized, I think, seeing the artwork, as someone who also works in an interdisciplinary practice and doesn't really see, feels like the modality is less important than just where the sensibility of the curiosity, that there's a way in which having time to spend with her work was really important to understanding even how to translate the poems, and that there was a certain, je ne sais quoi, if you will, to just say that.
Okay.
Sorry, everyone's sorry. But a certain kind of sensibility, that this humor that you also see in her sculptures. I'm sure many people here got a chance to see the fantastic exhibition when it was here in New York last year, and something about embodying that, I think, intuitively, even though it's inchoate and I'm giving a very kind of vague answer, I think led me into how to approach the poems. And as to the question of, I would say it's also, at least for me, intuitive about, if adaptation then becomes about, the vanity of, I would never want to impose my project on her. So whenever I was going maybe what seems like superficially far, so I talk about in the intro about this Gelben Wellen, I chose to translate that as a slant run mauve waves, because even though a descriptive translation would be yellow, in the poem, I felt that would really actually, to say yellow waves in the poem would actually be to go farther from her intention than to stay close. For me, mauve waves was staying close, even though a certain reviewer might, point at that and say this person doesn't know German, or that they don't care about Oppenheim's intentions. But for me, it was a form of respect. And I think in terms of, so long as you're not, that's always going to be an intuitive process. But I think if you trust your own intentions and trying to go with theirs. I mean, you're of course also a translator, translated over 60 books, and I think there's some way in which there has to be a certain giving over, and that's what I tried to do to make a long story long.
It's a beautiful use of the frame motif.
Yeah, I think what Kathleen is referring to is this way I've been thinking about translation, which is as an an extreme constraint for my own writing. So if a sonnet is a constraint where you have 14 lines and a certain rhyme scheme and everything, then translation is writing with the extreme constraint of the original language. And so I think, to me, I was really interested in tone, and I think that led most of my decision making when I came to difficult moments, as well as what I was talking about earlier in terms of having a sense of an internal logic in the poem and trying to replicate that in English. I think also, I mean, my hope is that hundreds more people will translate Joyce Mansour, and that actually through versioning, you get to something beautiful. Not necessarily closer. Like I don't know that there is a closer to an original, but that this is one set of readings of a poet, and that's okay. It's not complete or finished or anything like that, but rather translation can be a sort of proliferation outward.
Absolutely. And of course, the thing we sometimes tend to forget is that not only is translation a reading, which is going to differ from translator to translator, but reading differs from reader to reader. And the way any of you individually are going to read either of these books is going to be different from the person sitting next to you. So we always tend to think of this as a monolithic experience, that translation somehow comes along and, and just demolishes. But in fact, no, it's very much within that same current, that same dynamic current of what it means to engage with a literary text. And I'll also point out that I spotted in both of you opportunities you're talking about found in translation. So you had Whiten and Die, and I think you had Despair and Air, a nice rhyme that came in one of the poems, and I looked at the original. Of course, it's not there. So there are these opportunities that one can seize, which enrich the experience and, as you say, come back to the tone and honor the tone and the intent of the writer at the same time. I'd like to get back to our original thought about women in surrealism. So, Kathleen, you quote Oppenheim as saying, it felt like millennia of discrimination against women are resting on my shoulders. And there's also a quote that I came upon at one point where she says that for us women, surrealism represented a world in which we could rebel against the conventions of our upbringing and in which imagination was a key to a more liberated life. So it seems like, as with many people, as with many women, as with many men as well, her relationship to the surrealist movement and to the people in it was somewhat ambivalent, understandably so. Could you speak a little bit more, just let our audience know a little bit more about Oppenheim's history with surrealism, her feelings toward it, what her frustrations, what she took from it, and any of that.
Yeah, Oppenheim, I think, had, as you mentioned, an ambivalent relationship to the terms being labeled a surrealist artist, and then even with, I would say, feminism as a label or women-only exhibitions. But clearly in her work embodies the spirit of freedom that also you talk about, Mark, in his book, as being a modality through which then to find space to create her art. And she was famously quoted as saying, Die Freiheit wird einem nicht gegeben, man muss sie sich nehmen, which I would translate as, nobody will give you freedom. You can hear probably in the German, this reflexive, you have to seize it. That there's something about kind of resting your imagination into and giving it a lived reality. And I think that's the thing that I find most exciting about her work. And there is this, and I think I certainly can't speak for Oppenheim, but as artist translators that we are all here at the table, I think it's always exciting then to turn back to the nuance and multifaceted aspects of the work. That maybe labels are useful for organizing, but that what's interesting is the complexity of the work itself. And so I would imagine or gently venture that if she had ambivalence around those labels, it was because she sort of wanted to be seen in her singularity. And I think she managed that. I mean, in her work.
Absolutely, yeah. But very often, unfortunately, by getting out.
Yeah, exactly.
Take what you need and then leave. Catherine, related question. So you spoke in your introductory remarks about the sort of the dark side of of equality, the darker side of sexuality and feminism. And you talk in your introduction, I think, about the male surrealist take on women's desire. And which of course is famously embodied in Breton's notion of the femme enfant, the child woman, who is sort of this, wondrous creature of all innocence and creativity, but didn't really have a whole lot of agency other than to say, man person, you're great, Mansour, on the other hand, I love this expression of yours. You say that she radicalizes desire and gives it back its teeth. Could you speak to that a bit, and maybe how that also impacted on her relationship with surrealism, but with her own writing as well?
Yeah, it's great to do these events with Kathleen because I feel like Oppenheim and Mansour's relationship with surrealism couldn't really be more different. Mansour was very much a card-carrying member of the Surrealists. She was everywhere that they were. One of the few people that never had a falling out with Breton. And so it was definitely a generative and important space for her, especially in her collaborations with a lot of different surrealist artists. I think for me, what's really important about how her surrealism differs from that of many male surrealists is the way that she, I think, brings surrealism back to the body. It's very corporeal. Whereas many male surrealists were interested in, this dream life, this sort of almost disembodied life of the mind. She's constantly tied to the corporeal, to sort of viscous bodily images like blood, like urine, like all of those sorts of realities of what it means to be human that sometimes you feel the male surrealists are almost fleeing from. She wants to kind of put your nose in it.
Absolutely. And actually that's also a great segue, because you're absolutely right. I think we often have a sense that the canonical surrealist poets, the Bretons and the Éloirs and the Aragons and Desnos, there's something, it could be very passionate and lyrical, but it's also a little abstract in a lot of cases. Bretons in particular can be very cerebral. I love it. It's thrilling, but it's kind of removed and out there. And the work of both these poets, I found, has a much more concrete quality. I think in Mansour, as you said, Catherine, that it's much more corporeal. It's much more involved with the body and bodily reality in a way that probably left some of her male contemporaries a bit squeamish. And in Oppenheim, I find that I don't know, I'm speculating that maybe the relationship between her written output and her visual plastic output has a kind of interpenetration, because I find some of the poems had a sort of concrete descriptive quality that almost seemed as if she was describing a work that she might have created herself, a visual work that she might have created herself. So I'm wondering if I can ask both of you to comment on the notion specifically of, both of these artists produced writing, but they also produced visual works. Mansour created a number of surrealist objects, as she was mostly known as a poet. The flip side, Oppenheim, mostly known as a visual artist, but created this important body of written work. Can the two of you maybe speak a little to that, and how that cross-channel might have actually impacted on their work? And is this something, again, that in your engagement with them in your translation is something that maybe impacted on it?
Sure. So I think that for Mansour, it was really her object. So she had these, you might have seen them in the Met show, Surrealism Beyond Borders. There was one of her objets méchants, and it's a sort of ball with nails in it.
It kind of looks like a mouth with teeth, I think.
Yeah. And I think of her visual art output as a way of being in community. It was so important to the Surrealists, their milieu, the people that they spent time with and what they were making. And so to me, it seemed like one more way for her to sort of be in conversation with them. I was at a residency over the summer, and Mark Wunderlich said, to a room of writers, nobody cares if you ever write a word ever again, which is totally true, right? Like, and I think that the Surrealists had that in mind in terms of their community building. Like only your friends really care about what you're writing. And so I think that's sort of how I think about her creation of objects by and large.
Yeah, and I wonder, to link up also to your earlier question, Mark, if Oppenheim's poetry was also maybe a way of wresting freedom from the association with objet, which she did later kind of in her career, understandably resent a little bit. Nobody wants to be a one-hit wonder in music or art or anything else for that matter. And so that fur-lined teacup, which Breton also called déjeuner en fur, was
Fur-covered breakfast.
yes, yeah, and
For
that
lunch.
play on Venus and fur, and then Mayonnaise déjeuner, so the kind of mashup of those. Whether the poems are also another way of creating a new space to sort of distance from the sense of being only, being one thing. And I mentioned the example of the title poem of this collection being associated with a fantastic painting, the one that she did Max France, which was in the MoMA show last year. And then there's a drawing that she did, I think it's 10,000 Year Difference with the poem that I placed last in the collection, this self-portrait from 50,000 BC to X, which I think in the drawing, the work on paper, is 60,000 BC to X, I think. Don't quote me on that 100%, but I'm pretty sure that's right. You can see then, that there is a direct dialogue where she's making a visual work, but then also that's coming out through the prose. And also Kathleen von Klunerode, which was a figure she was fascinated with, comes up in this prose poem that has this wonderful kind of gender-bending transformation in the poem where a person named Astor then wakes up with a card in the chest pocket of a suit coat as Caroline. And so I think, maybe even thinking again about that notion of when I looked at the work in the exhibition, and then that was again in this amorphous way of translating that somehow for her it was all, maybe not a Gesamtkunstwerk, as they say, in German and English, not that she was sort of working toward, because how could I pretend to know that, but working toward having all of it, the oeuvre, and to relate. But I just think when you work interdisciplinary, that's kind of happens anyway, at least in my very end of one experience, that there's this way in which you just follow the curiosity, and then the things talk to each other in dialogue, and yeah, I feel so lucky to have the experience and to interact with the book in these levels.
Yeah, it just opens it up to other dimensions in both cases. I'm wondering, before we ask the floor for questions, prepare your questions, if we might ask both of you to read a little bit more. Yeah, in fact, Kathleen, you mentioned the last poem, which is one of my favorites. Maybe since you were just talking about it, let's hear it.
Okay. This is As Though Awake While Asleep, Sleeping. Sorry, let me start again. This is a prose poem, and it's called As Though Awake While Asleep, Seeing, Hearing. Asleep, Astor saw him hearing. With his eyes for some time he observed him, only to swiftly lie down beneath the blossoming rose bush in the wind, so swiftly that it took a while for him to see his artificial ears again approaching him from the opposite direction. He didn't hold it against them, however, and after quick consideration fastened them to his mother's last letter, or to the gnarled trunk of the Rockefeller Center. When he looked up, he saw that a few windows were leaning out of the building, signaling to him. Although he knew that the hedgehog inside the building was growing fatter, its bristles beginning to scratch the good child's skin. Until now he had always believed that the former would balk at chasing the windows into the desert and into Mount Etna's open maw. There, the first drops began to fall, and one window after another alighted from its mortal remains, leaving behind no less than a shipload of bird shit. Astor took cover in an invisible molehill, proceeding sight unseen to the scene of the catastrophe. Fera forabilis. Lost in thought, Astor made his way back home. He lay down and quickly fell asleep. When he woke the next day, he found himself hanging on an unfamiliar coat hanger. In the pocket, he found a calling card, printed with his new name, Caroline.
So I'll read from the last poem in the collection, first from the very beginning and then from the end. I think that after Breton's death, I think that Mansour becomes much stranger. And so this poem is from 1981. Have you read? Have you written? Have you read what you have written? Who are you? And above all, what do you expect of the eraser? I have loved, I have killed. I have loved the one who was quiet. Postscript in Cairo. After everything, the trance follows carnage, like the carnation, the garbage. So those are the first two stanzas, and now I'll read the ending. Wash your eyes in urine, rinse your mouths in urine, drink the urine of your sacred cows. In the secret boot of a legless man, forget the Orient. This is life. Twilight spreads like an ass on a bench. Everywhere the pretty afternoon dies. Mourn in order to laugh. A disemboweled mole stains the path with its innards, not the rat. Animal of order and spite, the rat dies standing, facing the oppressor with bared teeth, uselessly voracious in the soft peat. The frame of the horizon fades into the dark. Death brandishes its wrinkled gut before the door of the wombs. This is life. Tear 3 fingernails from the incarnated corpse, 2 warts, a flat foot, simulate an erection, break the hymen of the stubborn low base, and come back tomorrow, vanquished by insomnia. It is life that announces this is life. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you both.
I thought somebody was
Yeah, so we even have-
whooping out there.
Right.
Whoop, whoop.
So I'm sure after these very inspiring readings, you are full of questions, and I would invite you to ask them. Who'd like to start? Who's going to be brave? Go for it.
I really enjoyed the conversation. I really thank you, the three of you, and especially for the work that you just put out and the publisher. 2 questions. One for Catherine. Do we know anything about Mansour's L1 pushing into the French somehow?
I'll
If we do,
yes,
then how do you deal with that in translating and rendering that, whatever you want to call it, echo, pushing layers, trying to.
Yeah. So, yes, happily. I will repeat the question. So the question was, how does Mansour's L1, which was English, push or appear or haunt what she wrote in French? So I've been thinking about this question a lot, particularly because it's a funny thing to translate somebody who chose to write in an adopted language into the language that they could have written in if they had chosen to. And I don't have a good answer to that problem that I find myself in, that predicament, as people say, other than I love the poems and I want more people to read them. And she's dead and she can't yell at me. So the second question so then how does it affect the work? I think that there's a directness in her French that is sort of a vestige of English syntax, I would say. And I tried to reproduce that. It's one of the things that I find makes her somewhat singular in the French. The sort of pushing your face against a mirror kind of quality that I think comes from, a lot of French writing has very long syntactical structures. She's hardly ever writing in that mode. So that's one thing. She also liked and enjoyed a sort of bilingual pun, which then translating it back into English loses some of its fun. But we all have to do things like that. So yeah, I think mostly it's this directness, this direct quality that she carries over from the English.
I have another question for the
Please.
For the poems that were self-translated. So first, which one did you translate into English, whether the French or the German, and then or vice versa, and then the self-translations, were they translations or were they self-transcreations, and how, if so, transcreations?
Sure. So I'll repeat the question for our live streamers. And thank you all so much for coming on this glorious summery day, both here in person and online. And to 192 Books for hosting, Katie at Full Poetry for bringing us together, and yeah, Mark and Catherine. I really appreciate it. So the question is, how did Meret Oppenheim translate the poems that she wrote herself in French and then translated into German? And what was my approach to translating them? So mostly what I did was consult the French first, but I did look at her German translations, which tended to mostly take the linguistic descriptive content and foreground that. And I tried to maintain the spirit of what I was doing in the other poems when I translated those 7 French poems and do something a bit more holistic. And we were talking the other day actually about the challenges of translating one's own work, and I do think that there can be this way in which when we're really close to a text, that there is a way in which that can create maybe other, I don't know if you would say impediments, but other, that there's something about maybe what you said, Catherine, about distance also than just being a new opportunity for interpretation.
Fascinating approach. So you translated, you'd say both into the English.
Yeah, because I looked at the German too. Yeah, so then it was an amalgamation of also trying to take us in some ways, and going back to this idea of adaptation and wanting to feel free, but also that freedom having a respect or constraint. And I was thinking about this last night. I was at the City Ballet, and when I was younger, I really didn't like classical ballet training. When I would be in class, it would always make me feel really inadequate, and it still makes me feel inadequate sometimes. But there's something about those constraints and the grammar of that I find so much freedom in, and I think it's just a really strong frame, And so there's something about the frame of translation, as Catherine terms it, that I felt like when I had that information of how she approached German, that I also wanted to respect or somehow use this information in approaching English translation.
Thank you. Another question. James.
It might be a silly question.
There's no such thing.
I was struck by the fact that the word maw appeared in both of these texts, and I think it's kind of a curious word in English, which I feel like it has a literal meaning, but also just a kind of tonal resonance. And I was wondering if you could just discuss what that word was in the original, and was it just a literal choice, or was there something that went into that choice?
So while you're looking, I'll repeat the question, which is, James was struck by the fact that the word maw, as had I been, by the way, was struck by the fact that the word maw, which is not one of those words you hear every single day, happens to appear in both of these books. And so the question was, is it from the same original word, or is it from different words? And how did that, what's that doing here? How did that manage to make its way in?
So I'll tell you that when this book came out, my brother texted me, and when we were growing up, we had in front of the door this like a trunk that we would throw all of our crap in, so like your shoes, like whatever muddy stuff you had. And my mom called it the maw. She's like, put your shit in the maw, and so my family was like, wow, that really made an outsized impression on you. So I'll tell you that in the French, the word is la gueule, which is a word for mouth that's much more common than maw. But we also have, in French, they say ferme ta gueule, which is like shut your trap, right? So we have different kind of ways that you can refer to a mouth in English. I think that I just liked it. I think it's a beautiful word that we don't use enough. And so in the
Maybe
spirit,
we'll start now.
Right. So I think it was one of those things that I just enjoyed in the spirit of translating as an act of writing, of recreation. I just loved the way it sounded, the glittering maw, the glittering mouth. I don't like it.
Yeah, in my case too, it was, well, actually first we only do events with the word maw in the book title. So
it's actually a requirement for your submission to World Poetry.
The maw series.
In this poem, there was this great, I'll read it briefly, and so Latin in the journal. Die Fenster und die Lüste in den offenen Rachen des Ätna zu jagen. And I love that fence, the felt really important to me. So mouth and Ätna, similarly really lost that, and so I really wanted to go with chasing the windows into the desert and into Mount Etna's open maw, which has especially this, my one tell of being from New Orleans is I can't say the word on without diphthonging it into on, A-W-N. And that's with maw, so that kind of diphthong I think is really nice to mirror the mawness of Etna and what's happening in the poem of those being windows into.
Yeah, and also, I mean, the word maw just seems so much more wide open than mouth. You know, mouth can go, but maw is like, ah. and also, I don't know if this is true in German, Kathleen, but in French, the status of slang is very different from what it is in English. The French tend to have slang words for very common things, you know, mouth, money, doctor, whatever it might be, that we don't really use in English in the same way. You know, our slang tends to be more about the forbidden stuff. You know, we use slang for defecation and money and, you know, and sex and things like that. But the French just use it in a very common way. And for translators, it's actually a real pain in the ass because you want to get the right tone, but sometimes there isn't a slang word in English that just fits. And to use one sounds weird, you know, whereas gueule is, you know, ferme ta gueule is something that you'd hear in, you know, in the high registers of society just as well as on the street in Belleville. So it's, you know, it's a challenge. I don't know, does German work the same way or is it?
Yeah, I had a real tricky time with Geistkugel, one of the poems, and talk about this briefly in the introduction, that you know, Kugel can be really used idiomatically for like a kugel of ice cream, a scoop of ice cream, for a bullet, a sphere. And I wound up going with, so Geistkugel is an invented compound word, and I'm sure lots of people here in the audience know that German has this great kind of Lego block-like ability to assemble substantives. Kampfmittelbeseitigungsdienst, I don't know. I mean, there's just, you know, all kinds of words, you just kind of mash it all together. And I wanted to mash the words, so I went with sphere, but sphere is very polite. So she says earlier in the poem, I think, alle Gedanken, die je gedacht werden, or so. And I thought, okay, there I'm going to say each and every thought that had ever been thunk, and use this kind of idiomatic past participle of thunk, who'da thunk it, to give something that would, that you know, to just find that kind of replacement there, since I was losing it in sphere, which is very, almost crispy. So.
Yeah. No, I mean, tone, I think is probably one of the hardest things. And I know that the two of you are very attuned to it. And thank you for mentioning that when you were talking about translating Mansour. It's in a way, it's everything. And yet it's one of the hardest things to actually, at least in my experience, is one of the hardest things to actually grasp and capture. And so you're constantly sort of circling around it and trying to get it in there somehow.
Mark, may I ask you one question?
Sure.
How do you approach this question of like, what's a bridge too far adaptation?
Really good question. The one we never want to actually think about in public. You know, I think you answered it beautifully. It's largely instinct. It's largely a sense of you feel it. And I think for me the trick is to try to understand if there are various things going on, various strands happening in a text, meaning, tone, humor, perhaps, or ambivalence, or double entendre, whatever it might be. You know, authors will mash those things together, and sometimes you just have to make choices. And the choice might be, you know, what is the most important thing that in my reading of this piece I think the author is trying to convey, and let me try to get, you know, one, maybe two, maybe the top three if I can, but the rest of them are sometimes just going to have to go, because otherwise it becomes so convoluted that nothing comes through at all. And, you know, I will say, as another plug for these books, which you can buy right up there, and they both have the word maw in them, so don't forget. One of the things that I really admire about both of these translations is how beautifully they avoid exactly that, you know, as a translator, of course, I'm always looking back at the original and saying, how did you do that? You know, what's going on here? And constantly struck by the fact that there's no moment where I felt that it was being overreached, you know, that the effect was trying to be gained at the expense of something that really should have been kept. The tone is absolutely perfect. So one more question and then we will wrap up. Yes.
I'm curious about both of you, doing your relationships with these authors, and not necessarily with, specifically translation. What was something that like surprised you along the way, where you were like, okay, I know them, you know what you're doing, and that's something that surprised you with their writing?
That's a great question. So the question is, during your translation, was there something that surprised you once you had sort of gotten started and became familiar with the writer? Is that a good summation of what you're asking?
Yeah, I mean, not necessarily like translation, throughout your sort of like relationship with authors.
Okay. Yeah, I think that for me, Mansour is so capacious and many voiced. I think there are certain people that you would translate where, yes, I think you could fall into a sort of, this is a thing that they do. And so I always translate it the same way, and a sort of complacency maybe that I definitely did not find translating her, because she's so constantly shifting this image of the chameleon, I think. I think something that really surprised me was maybe something I learned more when speaking with her family, who control her estate, which is and Mark's really wonderful biography of Breton notes how sort of self-mythologizing Joyce Mansour was. So who knows if this is true? But in asking if I could visit the archive, I was told that there were no drafts of the poems, that everything was a final draft. And so that was surprising to me. And who knows if it's true.
And I think for me the surprising thing was, there was perhaps seen as, it was first of all just good fortune. Oppenheim's work, so Surkamp published her collected poems along with prose in an edition that I want to say first came out in '86. I might be off by a year or two. And her work had been translated into some other languages in the 80s and I think also 90s, but had not been translated except for the Vice Perugé monograph, which is out of print from Parquet from '83. Which was just a selection of a dozen at all into English around the time that this exhibition was happening. And we can often think of, oh, here's a major artist who's working in this visual sphere, and then the poems are ancillary. And I would say no, like not only Oppenheim, I was so surprised and delighted by that these poems are of the highest literary order and stand, I think, alongside her remarkable visual artistic production as just fantastic works. And I'll do a small plug, really shameless plug for this edition, and also thank you to World Poetry and Surkamp, because the Surkamp edition is kind of a historical, also archival, which is really valuable method of organizing the poems chronologically with date lines, and then also some uncollected prose that she had. And I was really grateful to be able to assemble these for English language readers alongside the German en face, in a way that attempted to again respect through adaptation, the intention of the poems in dialogue with each other. So to present it as a curated collection and order them accordingly. So thank you, for poetry and Surkamp for that. Please do.
And I think we are hitting the time limit here. So thank all of you for coming out on this beautiful day and for your attention and for your participation. And thank you so much to Kathleen and to Catherine for your wonderfully thoughtful and articulate answers. Let's have a hand.
Thanks so much.